There's something wrong with the human brain. Tell someone they can't go somewhere, and that's immediately the only place they want to be. America has no shortage of those places: sealed-off islands, crumbling ruins, entire towns locked behind federal fencing. Some are forbidden because they're dangerous, some because the government would rather you didn't ask questions, and some because the history inside is too dark, too embarrassing, or too complicated to put on a tour brochure. These are 10 abandoned places in America you're forbidden to enter. Place 10, North Brother Island, New York City, New York. 2 miles from Midtown Manhattan, sitting right in the East River between the Bronx and Rikers Island, there's a 20-acre island that most New Yorkers have never set foot on, and never will. You can see it from the highway. You can see it from planes coming into LaGuardia. But you cannot go there. North Brother Island has been sealed off from the public since 1963. The NYC Parks Department manages it, and they are not exactly rolling out the welcome mat. Permits to visit are issued only for what they call compelling academic and scientific purposes. If your reason isn't compelling enough, you're not getting on that boat. The island opened as Riverside Hospital in the 1880s, a quarantine facility for people with contagious diseases: smallpox, typhoid, tuberculosis. The city needed somewhere to put sick people away from everyone else, and a remote island in the river seemed like a perfectly reasonable solution if you weren't the one being sent there. Its most infamous resident was Mary Mallon, better known as Typhoid Mary. An Irish immigrant who worked as a cook, Mallon was identified by health authorities as the first documented asymptomatic carrier of typhoid fever in the United States. She'd infected at least 22 people across 7 wealthy households without ever showing a single symptom herself. She genuinely didn't believe she was sick. She fought the arrest, literally. When health officials came for her in 1907, she ran and hid for 5 hours behind a pile of ash cans before being physically dragged out and taken by boat to the island. She was released in 1910 on the condition that she would never work as a cook again. She agreed, promptly changed her name, and went right back to cooking. She was recaptured in 1915 and sent back to North Brother Island for the rest of her life. She died there in 1938 after 26 years of involuntary isolation, having never truly accepted that she was a danger to anyone. Then, in June 1904, before all of that, the island witnessed something far worse. The steamship General Slocum caught fire in the East River and beached itself against the island's rocks. Over 1,000 people died, mostly German-American women and children, on a church picnic outing. It remained the deadliest disaster in New York City history until September 11, 2001. After World War II, the island briefly housed veterans' families, then became a drug rehabilitation center for teenagers in the 1950s. That program closed in 1963 under accusations of corruption and failure, and the island has been empty ever since. Today, all 25 original buildings still stand in various states of collapse. Trees grow through shattered windows. Vines have swallowed entire walls. The Parks Department says the structures pose a considerable threat to any visitor, which is one reason they keep it closed. The other reason is that the island is now a protected bird sanctuary. Herons, egrets, and barn swallows nest in the ruins of the old hospital wards. In a way, nature has taken the island back, and it doesn't particularly want you there either. Place 9, Pennhurst State School and Hospital, Spring City, Pennsylvania. In 1968, a local television reporter named Bill Baldini walked into Pennhurst State School and Hospital in Spring City, Pennsylvania, and filmed what he found there. The resulting 5-part news series, which aired on Philadelphia's NBC affiliate under the title Suffer the Little Children, showed Americans something their government had been quietly running for 60 years. A facility so overcrowded, so understaffed, and so abusive that it shocked the country into finally paying attention. Pennhurst had opened in 1908 under the name the Eastern Pennsylvania Institution for the Feeble-Minded and Epileptic. The name tells you everything about the thinking behind it. The Pennsylvania legislature had commissioned a survey of the state's disabled population and decided the answer was segregation. Remove people with intellectual and physical disabilities from the general public, put them somewhere out of the way, and keep them there. By 1957, Pennhurst housed nearly 3,500 people in a facility designed for far fewer. Residents slept in overcrowded wards, received little to no treatment, and in documented cases were physically abused by staff. In 1983, 9 Pennhurst employees were indicted on assault charges, including staff who had arranged for patients to assault each other. One physician, according to court records, had asked a colleague which injection would cause the most pain without causing permanent damage, and then administered it to a patient he deemed a disciplinary problem. The landmark civil rights lawsuit Halderman versus Pennhurst State School and Hospital, filed in 1974, eventually reached the U.S. Supreme Court and resulted in a 1984 settlement mandating the institution's closure. Pennhurst officially shut down on December 9, 1987. The 1,156 people still living there on the date of the court's order were moved into small community homes, and then, for years, the campus sat empty. Today, the lower campus has been partially developed into a historical museum and a seasonal haunted attraction, which remains controversial among disability rights advocates who argue the site deserves more than a Halloween backdrop. But large portions of the 32-building complex remain closed to the public, structurally condemned, stripped of anything valuable, and slowly deteriorating. Several buildings were demolished between 2018 and 2020 after being declared unsafe for any use. The underground tunnel network connecting the facility's buildings is among the most deteriorated sections on the property, and access is prohibited entirely. The Pennhurst Memorial and Preservation Alliance has spent years arguing that the site deserves recognition as what they call it, an internationally recognized site of conscience and a place where a major civil rights battle was fought and won, with the evidence of what made that fight necessary still visible in the walls. Place 8. Six Flags New Orleans, Louisiana. In August 2005, Hurricane Katrina flooded Six Flags New Orleans under 10 feet of water. The park, which had opened in 2000 as Jazzland before being rebranded, never reopened. For nearly 20 years, it sat abandoned on 140 acres of land in eastern New Orleans, rusting into one of the most surreal post-apocalyptic landscapes in America. Roller coasters standing half-submerged, bumper cars exactly where they were left, a carousel frozen mid-spin, ticket booths with menus still on the walls, prices still posted as if someone might come along and order. The cartoonish Warner Brothers characters painted on faded walls stared out from an orange-tinged mural across a parking lot that hadn't seen a car in years. The city tried for nearly 2 decades to find a developer willing to take on the site. Deal after deal collapsed. The land was contaminated, the infrastructure was destroyed, and the cost of demolition alone was astronomical. Trespassers had long since picked the place over. Urban explorers posted footage from inside the park regularly. The kind of footage that looks like it belongs in a horror film because it basically does. Demolition finally began in 2025, putting an end to the ruins' strange 2-decade run as an unofficial landmark of disaster and neglect. But for most of those years, the fence around the property was the only thing technically keeping people out, and it wasn't always very effective. The city still prosecuted trespassers, and the site remained genuinely dangerous. Unstable structures, contaminated soil, and a security team that patrolled the perimeter. What made Six Flags New Orleans so striking wasn't just the decay, it was the scale of it. This wasn't a small building or an empty lot. It was an entire amusement park, frozen in 2005, slowly being consumed by Louisiana heat and humidity, visible from the highway, impossible to ignore. There's also the question of what the site says about New Orleans itself, a city that spent years after Katrina watching large swaths of its eastern neighborhoods stay empty while political arguments about who was responsible went nowhere. Six Flags wasn't unique in that sense. It was just the most visible example of it. A 140-acre monument to the gap between promises and outcomes, sitting right off a major interstate so that nobody who drove past could pretend they hadn't noticed. Place 7, Plum Island Animal Disease Center, Orient Point, New York. About a mile and a half off the tip of Long Island's North Fork sits Plum Island, 840 acres of restricted federal property that the government has spent decades being deliberately vague about. Officially, Plum Island Animal Disease Center is a research facility operated, until recently, by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, dedicated to studying dangerous animal diseases like foot and mouth disease. That's the official story. The unofficial story, or at least the one that's kept journalists and conspiracy theorists busy for years, involves allegations of dangerous experiments, biosafety failures, and questions about what exactly has been studied there over the decades. The island's research history goes back to 1954, when it was established to study foot and mouth disease, a virus that devastates livestock and is banned from being studied on the U.S. mainland because of the risk it poses to the American agricultural industry. During the Cold War, the U.S. Army had previously operated a biological warfare research program on the island, which was officially shuttered in 1969. What's not disputed, access to Plum Island has always been tightly controlled. Visitors must be federally cleared. No unauthorized boats are permitted within a certain distance. The staff ferry runs from a government dock, not a public terminal. For decades, aerial photography of the island was restricted. Michael Carroll, an attorney and author, wrote an investigative book in 2004 titled Lab 257, arguing that Plum Island's biosafety record was deeply flawed and raising questions about whether diseases that appeared on Long Island, including Lyme disease and a 1999 outbreak of West Nile virus, could be connected to the facility. The government denied those claims, and most scientists have not found the evidence persuasive. But the book sold well because the island's secrecy made those questions very easy to ask. The federal government announced plans to close the Plum Island facility and transfer its research to a new biosafety laboratory in Manhattan, Kansas. A decision that itself sparked considerable local debate about moving such research to the American heartland. As of now, Plum Island remains operational and remains closed to the public. What's telling about Plum Island isn't necessarily that anything sinister happened there. It's that the secrecy itself became the story. When you restrict access completely, prohibit photography from the air, and run your staff on a private ferry from a government dock, you create exactly the conditions in which people start asking questions you'd probably prefer they didn't. The island is a good reminder that transparency and trust tend to move together, and the absence of one has a way of generating a lot of creative theories about the other. Place 6, the Hanford site, Richland, Washington. Most people know about Chernobyl. Fewer people know that the United States has its own version. Not a reactor accident, but something arguably messier. 56 square miles of federal land along the Columbia River in Washington state that produced the plutonium used in the atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki and then spent the next several decades generating some of the most radioactively contaminated soil and groundwater in the Western Hemisphere. The Hanford site began operations in 1943 as part of the Manhattan Project. At its peak, 9 nuclear reactors operated along the Columbia River. The plutonium produced there fueled America's nuclear weapons program throughout the Cold War. Workers processed nuclear material in massive facilities, and the waste, billions of gallons of it, was stored in 177 underground tanks, many of which have since leaked into the surrounding soil. The cleanup effort at Hanford is the largest and most complex nuclear remediation project in U.S. history. It has been ongoing since 1989. Has cost tens of billions of dollars, and is not expected to be completed until the 2060s at the earliest. Some estimates push that date much further. Certain areas of the site will remain off-limits for thousands of years, not decades, thousands, because the contamination in the soil and groundwater cannot be fully removed with any technology currently available. The reactors themselves, 8 of the original 9, have been placed in a process called cocooning, where they are sealed and left to sit while the most radioactive materials decay to safer levels, which will take decades. The 9th reactor, the B reactor, was the world's first full-scale plutonium production reactor. It is now a National Historic Landmark and open for guided tours, though only through a specific reservation system and only to areas deemed safe for public access. The rest of Hanford is not open to anyone. It is patrolled, fenced, and monitored around the clock. The Columbia River, which borders the site, is still tested regularly for contamination. Place 5. The Buckner Building, Whittier, Alaska. At the edge of the tiny port town of Whittier, Alaska, there is a 14-story concrete building that has been condemned, sealed, and slowly collapsing since 1960. It is called the Buckner Building. You can see it from the water. You can see it from the road. Getting inside it, however, is not something the town or the state of Alaska is going to allow. During World War II, the U.S. Army built Whittier as a secret military port, accessible only through a tunnel bored through the Chugach Mountains. The tunnel was so classified that Whittier didn't appear on public maps for years. To house thousands of troops through brutal Alaskan winters, the Army constructed the Buckner Building, described at the time as a city under one roof. It contained barracks, a hospital, a theater, a bowling alley, and shops, all within a single reinforced concrete structure on the Alaskan coastline. When the Army abandoned Whittier in 1960, the Buckner Building was left exactly as it stood. No demolition plan, no salvage operation, no handoff. Just locked doors and a building full of everything the military had left behind. The Alaskan climate moved in immediately. Water penetrated the structure, froze, expanded, and cracked the concrete from the inside. Mold took hold throughout. Floors began to give way. The building has been structurally condemned for decades, and access is prohibited on grounds that it poses a serious risk of injury or death to anyone who enters. Locals have wrestled with the question of what to do with it for as long as it has been standing empty. The answer, consistently, is that nobody can afford to do anything. Demolishing a 14-story reinforced concrete structure in a location accessible only by a single mountain tunnel or by boat in one of the most extreme weather environments in North America would cost an extraordinary amount of money that no one has committed. So, the Buckner Building remains, open to 400+ inches of annual snowfall, winds exceeding 60 miles per hour, and roughly 300 cloudy days a year, slowly deteriorating on the shoreline of Prince William Sound, visible to every cruise ship and tourist ferry that passes through, and completely off-limits to all of them. Ivory Place 4, Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, Weston, West Virginia. Completed in 1881, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in Weston, West Virginia is the largest hand-cut stone masonry building in the United States, and arguably one of the most disturbing places in the country. It was built on the Kirkbride Plan, a 19th century architectural model that believed the layout of a building could itself be therapeutic. Long, rambling wings extending from a central block, designed to provide fresh air and natural light to patients, with the most disturbed patients housed at the far ends, away from the general population. The idea was humane, at least for its time. What actually happened inside was considerably less humane. The asylum was designed to hold 250 patients. By the 1950s, it was housing over 2,400. The overcrowding meant that the therapeutic ideals of the Kirkbride Plan gave way to warehousing. Patients sleeping in hallways, receiving little to no treatment, subjected to the full range of mid-20th century psychiatric interventions that ranged from ineffective to genuinely brutal. Lobotomies were performed here. So were insulin shock treatments and hydrotherapy. The asylum closed in 1994 after West Virginia shifted to community-based mental health care. It sat abandoned for years before being purchased by a private owner in 2007, who began restoration efforts and opened the building for tours, including the kind of nighttime ghost tours that have become standard for historic sites with sufficiently dark histories. But large portions of the building remain closed to the public, not because the owners want to hide anything, but because the structure itself is genuinely dangerous. Floors have collapsed. The roof leaks. Certain wings have been deemed structurally unsound. The building is enormous, over 242,000 square feet, and restoring it completely would take decades and more money than has ever materialized. The parts that are open give visitors enough of a sense of the place. The parts that aren't open, according to pretty much everyone who's worked on the restoration, are the ones you'd probably most want to see. One thing worth noting: the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum wasn't unusual for its era. Overcrowded state psychiatric institutions operating on inadequate funding, using treatments that today would be considered unconscionable, were the norm across much of 20th century America. Weston's asylum is just particularly large, particularly intact, and particularly visible, which is perhaps why it's become such a focal point. It's easier to reckon with history when it's still standing in front of you in 242,000 square feet of stone and broken glass. Place 3. Gilman, Colorado. The town the EPA shut down. Perched on a 600-foot cliff above the Eagle River in Eagle County, Colorado, the abandoned town of Gilman is visible from Highway 24 as you drive through the mountains between Minturn and Tennessee Pass. You can see the buildings up there on the ledge, houses, a school, what was once a gas station, all sitting exactly as they were left in 1984. You just can't get anywhere near them. Gilman was founded in 1886 during the Colorado Silver Boom and spent nearly a century as a working company town, owned entirely by New Jersey Zinc Company and later Gulf and Western Industries. At its peak during World War II, the mine employed over 700 workers, and Gilman's population exceeded 1,000. Zinc from the Eagle mine was critical to the war effort, so critical that Gilman miners received draft exemptions. The town had a bowling alley, a school, and company housing climbing the cliff face above the river. It was, in its strange way, a functioning community for close to 100 years. Then the EPA arrived. Decades of mining had released massive amounts of toxic pollutants, heavy metals, sulfuric acid compounds, contaminated runoff, directly into the Eagle River and the surrounding soil. By 1984, the contamination was severe enough that the EPA ordered the mine closed and the town evacuated. Residents were given notice and told to leave. The evacuation happened fast. People packed what they could carry and walked away from homes, furniture, appliances, and personal belongings that are still sitting in those houses on the cliff today. The post office closed in April 1986. In spring 1985, Battle Mountain Corporation evicted the remaining holdouts. Gilman became an official ghost town. The EPA designated 235 acres, containing an estimated 8 million tons of mine waste, a Superfund site. The site was placed on the National Priorities List and cleanup began in 1988. The EPA declared the remediation substantially complete in 2000, but the property remains strictly private and entirely off-limits to the public. Signs at the locked entrance gate warn of hidden and visible dangers and the risk of injury or death. Law enforcement actively prosecutes trespassers. The only legal way to see Gilman is to pull over on Highway 24 and look up. Inside the buildings, according to photographs taken by trespassers who've documented the consequences of ignoring the signs, X-rays are still strewn across the floors of the old hospital. Mine records sit in office drawers. A rusted swing set and a slide still stand in the old schoolyard. In 2007, a developer proposed converting the site into a private ski resort. The plans collapsed. Gilman remains on the cliff, locked, toxic in places, and completely unreachable. a full town frozen not by fire or flood, but by a government order that came with 60 days' notice and no appeal. Place 2. The Nevada National Security Site, Mercury, Nevada. Most people have heard of Area 51. Fewer pay much attention to what's roughly 65 miles to the south. The Nevada National Security Site, formerly known as the Nevada Test Site, where the United States detonated over 900 nuclear devices between 1951 and 1992. 900. Above ground, underground, on towers, dropped from aircraft, and fired from artillery. The landscape out there looks like a moonscape, enormous craters visible from satellite imagery, some of them nearly a mile wide and hundreds of feet deep. The Sedan crater, formed by a 104-kiloton thermonuclear device detonated underground in 1962, is 320 feet deep and nearly 1,300 feet wide. It was created as part of a program called Plowshare, which was studying whether nuclear explosions could be used for large-scale civil engineering projects like digging canals. They decided, eventually, that the answer was no. The site covers 1,360 square miles of desert, restricted, patrolled, surrounded by buffer zones that include part of the Nevada Test and Training Range. Public access is not permitted without federal clearance. A limited number of guided tours are occasionally offered through the National Nuclear Security Administration for educational and outreach purposes, but these are rare, tightly controlled, and cover only a small fraction of the site. The Department of Energy has characterized much of the site as suitable for unrestricted use following cleanup efforts, but certain areas remain contaminated and will remain restricted indefinitely. Underground cavities created by subsurface nuclear tests dot the landscape beneath the surface, and some areas still register elevated radiation levels. What makes the Nevada National Security Site strange? Beyond the obvious strangeness of a place where they set off hundreds of nuclear bombs, is how ordinary parts of it looked. The test site had its own town, Mercury, Nevada, with housing, a cafeteria, a bowling alley, and a baseball field. At its peak during the 1950s and 1960s, thousands of workers commuted there daily. Most of Mercury's buildings still stand, empty, in the middle of a restricted federal zone. Place 1. The Packard Automotive Plant, Detroit, Michigan. The Packard Automotive Plant in Detroit isn't an island, and it's not in the middle of the ocean. It's right in the middle of a city. 3.5 million square feet of crumbling, reinforced concrete spread across 40 acres on East Grand Boulevard, and for decades it was the largest abandoned industrial structure in the United States. Packard was one of America's most prestigious automobile manufacturers. At its peak in the early 20th century, owning a Packard was a statement, the kind of car that presidents rode in, that celebrities commissioned, that signified a certain level of arrival. The Detroit plant, designed by architect Albert Kahn and opened in 1903, was a state-of-the-art manufacturing facility. It pioneered the use of reinforced concrete in industrial construction, a technique that would go on to define American factory architecture for decades. Packard stopped producing cars in 1956 after a disastrous merger with Studebaker. The plant was sold and used for various light industrial purposes through the 1970s and 1980s before being fully abandoned in 1991. What followed was a slow, spectacular collapse. Roof sections caving in, floors giving way, the entire structure being picked over by scrappers who stripped out everything valuable, then by graffiti artists, then by urban explorers, and then by arsonists. Detroit's city government tried for years to find someone to do something with the plant. The building changed hands multiple times. An Argentine developer purchased the property in 2013 with ambitious redevelopment plans that never materialized. The city eventually moved to demolish sections of the structure after portions became too dangerous to leave standing. Here's what separates the Packard plant from just being a large, abandoned building. While it was officially off-limits, people kept finding remarkable uses for it. In the late 1980s and through the 1990s, when the building was supposedly secured, Detroit's underground techno scene was holding raves inside the ruins. The plant became, improbably, a kind of birthplace. The cavernous, echoing spaces of a condemned factory turned into the sonic environment that helped define an entire genre of music. In 2010, a Banksy mural was discovered on the interior walls. It was titled, "I Remember When All This Was Trees." In 2015, it was carefully removed and sold at a Beverly Hills art gallery for $137,500. A condemned factory in Detroit, a Banksy on the wall, underground raves in the rubble. You couldn't write it. Demolition has been ongoing since 2022, with most of the complex now cleared. Two of the historic buildings on East Grand Boulevard are being preserved for potential redevelopment. What the site becomes next is still undecided, but whatever it is, it will have a harder time being as interesting as what it was while it was supposed to be empty. Every place on this list tells you something about what gets built, what gets left behind, and what happens when a society moves on without cleaning up after itself. Some of these sites are forbidden because they're genuinely dangerous. Some because they're contaminated in ways that won't resolve for generations. And some because the stories they hold are still too complicated, too embarrassing, or too painful to put on a tour schedule. The fence around most of these places isn't just legal, it's a statement. We'd rather you didn't look too closely. If you found this interesting, hit the like button and subscribe. There are plenty more forgotten places, buried histories, and things the map would rather you overlook. We'll keep finding them.